So why does Xerces care about invertebrates? Well, as E.O. Wilson said, they're the little creatures that run the world. They do a lot of things that sometimes we don't think about. For instance, decomposition services. They're very involved in biocontrol. We'd be overrun with pests if we didn't have them. They're the base of many food chains. And of course, we get pollination services. Xerces works in four main areas: conservation, advocacy, research, and education. What I'm doing now is an example of education. On the conservation front, Xerces will work with land managers, federal, state, local agencies, and others that are interested in bettering their habitat for pollinators and other invertebrates. And then Xerces is composed of a lot of scientists, and they work with others at universities around the world, actually, on projects oriented towards conservation. In its 50 years, Xerces has protected and restored over 3.5 million acres. We work with a number of partners besides what I've mentioned. We have 18,000 members in Xerces, ambassador volunteers like myself, people that work in community science, and I'll talk about some of those things way towards the end. And just people out in their, backyards that are, members and trying to do good things. So why should we care about pollinators? Well, I will answer that question with another question. And that is, have you ever eaten sunlight? And, some of you might think this guy seems a little nutty. Why would he ask that question? But I'm not nutty. Because of course, the only thing that can eat sunlight are plants, phytoplankton, and a few bacteria. And all of the energy that serves as the basis for life on Earth comes from the sun. We know that from our schooling. Since plants play such a big role, it's important to note that 85% of flowering plants require a pollinator. And 67% of all plants on Earth require a pollinator. So that is a big portion of these plants that are capturing sunlight for our food webs. So we know how this process works. I'll just go through it here. Here we have a field of, looks like some native sunflower, some type, that is capturing sunlight and turning it into biomass. And how that moves into the food web, well, there's various ways. And, we recognize these. And we may even have, participated like this little boy eating blueberries. In terms of our own human needs, there's a figure 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food and drink we consume can be attributed to pollination services. That obviously depends on your diet, et cetera, but it's a good number. Globally, there are roughly 1,200 crops. They include things like cocoa, things that we may not think of. And then if you look at the market value of these pollination services in today's dollars, probably close to $1 trillion. And we get much more than just food. We get, enrichment. We get springtime flowers. I myself love pumpkin pie, so I'm glad for pollinators as far as that goes, but they bring us so many more things. Now, I want to talk a little bit about pollinator diversity. There are 6 main groups of pollinators, and these are butterflies, moths, flies, bees, wasps, and beetles. And out of these, the most important are bees. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about how do you distinguish bees from wasps. Some people get a little mixed up on this. Bees in general are hairier. A lot of times you're going to see, if you're looking at a female, most of the time you're going to see someplace that they're carrying pollen. They fold their wings over their back. Wasps, on the other hand, you almost have to look under a microscope to be able to see hairs on them. Very slender, not as robust. And they hold their wings out in a kind of a V when they're sitting on a flower or something. If you want to look at how do you tell a bee from a fly, and actually there's some bee mimics that are flies that are really hard to tell apart. But one of the key features is look at the antennae. If they've got really short, stubby antennae, then it's a fly. Bees that have much longer antennae. So as I said, bees are the most important of these pollinators in general. There are specific cases where some of these other groups are important in their own right. But bees do something, they do three things actually. They collect and transport pollen. They forage in the area around their nest. So we call these central area foragers. And they also exhibit something called flower constancy. And what that means is that in general, on a given foraging trip, if there's enough of the same species of plant available, they will keep hitting that species during that trip. Now, it's not 100% hard and fast rule, and they'll deviate once in a while, but it's something that is clear enough if you're observing that even Aristotle back in the 4th century BC noticed and wrote about flower constancy in bees. I want to talk about how bees transport pollen. If we look here, this is transport that's a lump of pollen that's been moistened with a little bit of nectar. And that lump is on the hind leg of this bumblebee. And there's something called a pollen basket, basically, that carries this lump of pollen. The other way that bees carry pollen is either on something called a scopa that may be on the hind leg or under the abdomen, as in these pictures here. There are very few that'll carry internally, and so you won't see pollen on the outside, but it's really a real small amount of bees that do it that way. So honeybees are something that most people think of when we talk about bees. If I say, show me a bee or name a bee, a lot of people will pop up with this. Well, honeybees, they're not anything like our native bees. Number one, they're not native. Number two, they live in these huge colonies of tens of thousands of individuals. They're very important agricultural animals, and really they are to be thought of as managed livestock. So, this is a way to picture honeybees. They're extremely important for certain agricultural products. They've had problems keeping bees going. You've heard of colony collapse disorder probably, and some other problems. Things have kind of stabilized right now on that front. But we're not going to talk about honeybees. I'm here to talk about native bees. Native bees are mostly solitary, and they're very gentle, and they're unlikely to sting. Now, to get one of these bees to sting, you literally have to squeeze it between your fingers typically. The exception to that would be a colonial native bee like a bumblebee, because whenever bees have got a nest to protect, and this goes with honeybees or bumblebees, they've got larvae in there and they will protect that nest. So if you run into a bumblebee out on a flower and you kind of brush it with your finger, it'll fly away. It's not going to come back and try to sting you. But if you go poke your finger around in a bumblebee nest, then you will have a problem. Across the world, there are roughly 20,000 species of bees. If we look at North America, north of Mexico, there's anywhere from 3,600 to 4,000 species of bees. Oregon and Washington, maybe 600 to 800 species. A city like Portland, 100 to 150. And in a single yard, if you've got really good pollinator habitat, you could easily see, well, maybe not easily, but you could observe 30 to 40 different species in one single place. This is an example of some common Western bees, and these are bees that you could easily see if you're observant and you have the right habitat and plants. I'm not really going to go into these. It's just really to give you an idea for the variety in bees. And as far as, what do they do in detail? Well, we know shockingly little about that. In fact, we don't even really know where these bees are located a lot of times. What parts of the state have which bees? How many are out there? So there are projects underway to try to determine that. Oregon has something called the Oregon Bee Atlas. I participate in that. And we've got a team of volunteers goes out across the state and captures bees for identification by a taxonomist. We do a first pass on that. Washington is just starting up a bee atlas project modeled on Oregon. If any of you are interested in that, I would suggest maybe contacting your local extension office. One aspect of diversity is just the variation in size. Now, that previous picture, they weren't to scale. Here, we've got the largest and smallest bees in North America. That little bee is called a fairy bee, and the smaller one, the large bee, is a valley carpenter bee. Both of these can be found in California. The carpenter bees actually will range up into southern Oregon in some areas. And you can see, it's a huge size variation. You could stick, 3 of these little bees easily inside of just one eye of that large carpenter bee. Other aspects of diversity would just be the body morphology, the shapes of things, how hairy are some versus others, shiny green metallic colors, and a lot of them are kind of blah, blah, browns and blacks that don't really attract your attention so much. If you look over at the lower left-hand picture there, you might think, well, those eyes seem awful big to me. And in fact, they are. This is a nocturnal bee. So this bee is active in the dusk, and on a moonlit night, can actually forage in that low light condition. And that's, thanks to these large eyes that are on this bee. And it's actually has 30 times the sensitivity to light levels as normal bees do. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the natural history of bees, and that basically means, what do they do for a living? What we have here is an example of a solitary bee life cycle. This bee is a mining bee. They're spring bees. They come out early. The adults, this female here, will live maybe 3 to 4 weeks. That's the extent of their lifetime. During that time, anywhere from 20 to 30 eggs is the maximum that they'll lay. And what they do is they go and create a brood cell, what's called a brood cell. That's where they're going to lay their egg. If you look on the right-hand side, you see a cutaway of a brood cell with a pollen mass. Sometimes people call that a bee bread or a pollen ball, although the shape's not always circular. On the back side of this nest, you can see kind of a shiny surface, and they're actually covering that with antimicrobial and waterproofing to help protect the eggs once they seal that up. So once the pollen ball is finished, she's going to lay an egg. Depending on the species, 1 to 3 weeks later, it's going to hatch. It's going to go through 5 larval stages altogether. Again, the timing on that varies. And eventually, something called a prepupa, that's the last stage, is going to emerge. And in some species, it will wrap itself in a cocoon. Most of them actually don't do that. And it's going to stay there for 8 to 9 months. At the very end of that period, it will go ahead and pupate and finally emerge as an adult. And the life cycle is going to start all over again. So, you know, the takeaway from this is that the bees that we see, we're only seeing just a short little glimpse of their existence. Now, 70% of our native species are ground nesters. And typical ground nests look something like this. Now, this is an aggregation. They're not all, in fact, most of them don't aggregate like this. But these look like little ant hills. They're very easy to miss. And if you stand still for a minute or so looking at one of these and you don't see any ants, then you know you probably have a bee on your hands. If you look to the right-hand side, you can see an example of some of the underground architectures that are employed. And these vary by species, and there's a tremendous variety in these. The other 30% of our natives are tunnel nesting species. So they will use old beetle holes, or they will excavate in plants that have pithy stems. So if there's a broken off stem and it's got some soft material in the center, they'll go ahead and excavate out and create brood chambers. The top one, I think, is probably a mason bee. On the bottom, let's go to the middle first. On the middle is a leaf cutter bee. Now, the middle picture, the reason it's bright is that this particular bee likes to use flower petals. And these are from the plant called Farewell to Spring. Some of you may be familiar with that. And on the bottom, we see that an example of how creative these bees can be when it comes to finding a place to create a nest. Now, this is just a divider in a sidewalk slabs. They're meant to be there. Maybe, you know, it's less than a pencil width. And somebody had a rug placed over this outside sidewalk. And when they pulled that up, they found this nest from a leaf cutter under there. And you can see why they call them leaf cutters. They use pieces of leaves for those nests. So we've covered this one, leaf pieces. Other nest materials that bees use, some of them use pebbles and plant resin. So the resins hold those pebbles together like glue. Others use soil for the partitions and the end caps, and those are mason bees. And then finally, there's some bee species that use plant hairs. So they will scrape hairs off of plants and use that to build a nest. Now, this picture would be pulled out of maybe a hollow stem or something like that. And it's not very long, you know, far across, half an inch at the most. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about a bumblebee life cycle. So we talked about solitary. Now we're going into what are known as colonial species. And we're going to start up here with a bumblebee queen. Well, she's not technically a queen yet. She's called a gyne, but she's a mated gyne, a reproductive from last year that's hibernated. And sometime in the late winter, early spring, she's going to come out of hibernation. And the first thing she'll do is tank up on nectar to get her reserves back up, kind of like bears. They start out fattened up and they burn through those energy reserves over the winter. And then she's going to start looking for a place to build a nest. So they like to use either a rodent burrow, not just because rodent burrows, rodent nests have insulation in them a lot of times, or maybe a hollow cavity. Most of the bumblebees in our area are actually ground nesters. So once she's found that, she is going to go and start getting ready to lay her first batch of eggs. And she'll go and create a wax pot here, and she's going to fill that with nectar. And this ball of pollen here, she'll lay eggs on top of that. And she is going to stay on those eggs much like a bird does on her own. In fact, there's a little part on the abdomen that makes body contact a little bit better to provide some heat to these larvae so they develop faster. If she runs out of nectar, she might leave but she will leave only if absolutely necessary. Finally, after 5 to 6 weeks, that first batch is out. They're going to become her workers. They will do the pollen and nectar collecting in the future. She is going to stay in there, and her duty will be to lay more eggs. And so this cycle is going to continue through, maybe 2 or 3 workers, generations. And then finally, late in the summer or fall, something called colony changeover is going to occur. What that means is that the queen is no longer going to be laying eggs destined to become workers. She's going to lay eggs destined to become reproductive. So that's going to be males and females. And somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 weeks after after this initial start, the reproductives are going to emerge and they're going to mate. And that is kind of the lifetime of this cycle, the reproductive lifetime. And I'm bringing this up because later on I'm going to talk about floral coverage. And if you've got a bumblebee colony somewhere and they run out of flowers, say long about here in the cycle, even though they've been working for, who knows, maybe 3 months, that colony is not going to reproduce. It's gone. So that's one of the things that's important about floral coverage. Now, bumblebees, they love overgrown places like this middle picture here. They do not want you to see the entrance to their nest. So what they like to do is drop down, crawl through some thick stuff, and then get into their nest. And that keeps predators from noticing where they are. Bumblebees, some of them will nest in grass tussocks. That wasn't in the illustration I showed earlier, but in some kind of a bunch grass. And that's an example of what, if you pull the bunch grass apart and you kind of look where they're hidden inside, this is an example of what that might look like. Now, all bees require flowers, and they will drink nectar from any accessible flower. And what that means is, can they get to the nectar? They're much more particular about pollen. And so we group bees into pollen generalist and pollen specialist. And there's degrees of specialization. And in the extreme, one species of bee may specialize on a single species of flower. Now, that's a dangerous situation to get into because either one of those can end the other one's existence. Butterflies, they share pretty much the same life cycle as bees do, with the exception being that butterflies are not nesters, they're egg layers. And so they find a host plant, they lay their eggs, and that's the end of it. They never go back and check on them. And so I want to make sure now that we have a clear understanding of what I mean when I'm talking about host plants. I'm sure everyone has heard of monarchs and milkweeds, so you kind of know what host plants are. But there are thousands of different associations between species of caterpillars and plants. Now, butterflies, which I've given as an example so far, are far outnumbered by moths. And so when it comes to caterpillars, it's important to have host plants, not just for butterflies, but for moths also. And I'll talk about why that is in a minute. Oh, one thing I forgot to say here. So just as a point of reference, when it comes to nectar plants, they really don't, butterflies and moths both, they really don't care what it is, as long as it's out there. Now, there are a few butterflies that don't have mouth parts. They don't live very long. Obviously, they don't need nectar plants. As far as overwintering, there's one difference between how butterflies might do that as opposed to bees. And that's that butterflies can actually overwinter as eggs, and there are no bees that do that. The rest of the life stages can be overwintering stages depending on the species. Now, I want to go back to this picture that we saw, not picture, but this slide that we saw earlier. and focus on these caterpillars. And again, remember that I'm not talking about just butterflies, but moths also. There are roughly 6 times as many moth species as there are butterflies. Caterpillars transfer more energy into food webs than any other animal. The general statement that could vary, in some terrain, but as a general statement, this is true. Now, there's another thing I want you to think about. Most birds forage within 50 yards of their nest. If you put 2 and 2 together, if you want to have a lot of birds in your neighborhood, in your yard, you want to put in host plants for caterpillars and moths. They're extremely important. Now let's talk about threats that bees face. There are 2 huge threats. First of these is habitat loss. You all know what it is. Here are some pictures, and I'm not going to talk about it really because we know it. The second big threat is pesticides. And pesticides in the US, we apply more than 1 billion pounds of pesticides a year. Unfortunately, the real misuse is not in that agricultural setting. The real misuse is in these urban landscapes where a lot of times we're applying for cosmetic reasons. And this is really, in my mind, almost an ecological crime to do that. Pesticides, they can get on your kids, they can get on your pets and wash off into the streams. And they're a serious issue. There was a study done in the South Puget Sound area where there was a higher rate of application in urban and suburban landscapes than there were on nearby farms. And the reason is people, don't pay attention to labels. And there's maybe a mindset of, well, if a little bit is good, then more will be even better. And we get in trouble thinking like that. Now, this picture, I want you to get in your mind because I'm going to come back to this later on. These bees are an example of roughly 100 to 150,000 bumblebees that died off over a period of about 2 weeks in Wilsonville back in 2013. And it's I'm going to get into the reasons for this, but think about this: 150,000 bumblebees dead in 2 weeks' time. The pesticides, bad deal. Besides killing things, they have something called sublethal effects, and this is where there's altered behavior, but not death. So sublethal effects include things like reproductive success being lowered, growth of larvae, and hence the adults will be smaller. Growth is slower. They have a lowered immune response, and they've got a lot of diseases and pests and parasites and things that they need to worry about. And then even foraging can be affected by sublethal effects. It can affect their ability to navigate and get back to their nest. So Xerces believes that this is the safest amount of pesticides. Another problem, although it doesn't rank as high as these others, is our pesticides in introduced species. If we look at parasites and pathogens, an example here would be something called a varroa mite. And a lot of you may have heard of this. It's on the back of this honeybee, and it's circled. And it looks something like this when you blow it up. And you might think, well, that's kind of cute. I wouldn't mind having a couple of these as pets. But the problem is they carry something called deformed wing virus. And what that does is it causes a serious problem. These little stubs off to the left and right side of this bumblebee are supposed to be wings. And so obviously this bee will never fly, never get out of the nest, and it'll never contribute to that nest. And if you get enough of them that have this, then that nest is lost, it goes nowhere. Another problem with introduced plants are, say, some of these really invasive plants like garlic mustard, and you have that up in the Vancouver area. This stuff will just take over areas and choke out natives. We have introduced predators such as this European paper wasp. And if you look carefully at this picture, it's munching away on a caterpillar. So they love to eat our native caterpillars. And finally, resource competition can be an issue if there are enough invasive species in any one area. Now, climate change is something that it's not as big as the other two, but it's certainly something that we need to worry about. Some of the effects on climate change, it causes our species to need to make moves. They either have to move to higher altitudes or higher latitudes. Higher altitudes, that's great until you run out of mountaintop or run out of, I should really say run out of a vegetative zone because you hit rock and ice. So that doesn't work. And if you're going to go to higher latitudes, well, you've got to have habitat to move through. And we know that habitat loss is one of our big problems. Another issue with climate change, possible issue, is something called phenological mismatch. I'm going to show you here a phenology wheel. And what this wheel is showing is an example of flower bloom during the year. So what you're seeing is January through May. And if we look, we've got bumblebees out here and flowers that correspond to flowers that they like. We've got this little green specialist bee. Remember, I talked about some bees only like certain kinds of flowers. So this particular bee likes this orange flower. And it appears in May. It's the same time as the specialist bees, and that's not that's not an accident, that's evolution. And if we let this play out for the remainder of the year, what we're going to find is everybody's happy. The bumblebees exit the year with flowers. Now let's look and see what happens if bees and flowers get out of sync because of climate change. Well, one thing that's happened is we got a flower in January that we didn't have before. If we look at the bumblebees, well, they've got flowers. Where is the little green? Okay, here's our little specialist bee. And if we remember, it needed an orange flower, but that orange flower came out in April. It's gone in May. And what this boils down to is that if we get to this much of a slip in synchronization, this particular bee is done for. Okay, there'll be no descendants. That's the end of the story. And that's a real possibility. Now, there's a lot of complexities in how these things go out of sync. That's a whole presentation in itself. So I'm not going to talk about that, but just be aware of it as a possibility. Then if we let the year play out, it's much like the last one I showed you. So what is the impact of all of these threats? Well, you see declines in pollinators and insect pollinated plants, widespread decline of North American bumblebees. Recently, I did a search on insect declines, got 38,400 results. Clearly something's going on. You all know this, you're bird people. I belong to an Audubon club myself. So we know there's a big decline in some bird species. If we look more closely to that, we see that if you take birds for which terrestrial birds for which insects are an essential food source over some stage of their lives, those birds have declined by 2.9 billion individuals over the last 50 years. If you look at the ones that are not dependent on insects during their life history, they basically remain flat. So what can we do about this? Well, Xerces has 4 principles that we follow for conservation. First is appropriate flowers and host plants. Make sure you provide them. Don't use pesticides. Provide nesting, egg laying, and sheltering sites. And finally, share the word. Now, I want to point out that beekeeping is not bee conservation. There are reasons for keeping bees, but bee conservation is not one of them. Bee conservation relies on habitat, and great habitat has secure nest sites. There's no use of pesticides, and there's adequate floral provision. If we look at natural areas, well, they've got all these things, right? These are really havens for our bees. There are areas that are, maybe you call them unnatural. They have some characteristics of natural areas, some more than others, and some more than others can be decent habitat depending on some of the low-level details of how they're managed. If we look at a suburban neighborhood, which is about as unnatural as you can get, even they can be okay, provided there are resources available. So we look up here, if you can see my pointer, this is a ground nesting bee, and it's got a nest in this yard. It's going to go make this circuit, and I'm not going to go into detail on all these stops, but it's going to get various things that it needs: flowering plants, pollen if there's some plants only provide pollen, etc. But it's going to get the things it needs, and it's going to survive. And there's the same thing with this cavity nester over here on the lower left. So a neighborhood can be a great place for a bee, provided everybody contributes something. So this appropriate flowers and host plants, that first principle that I talked about. Well, what do we need to plant? If we look, we want locally native plants to form the core. That's ideally. Doug Tallamy says it should be 60 to 70% native plants. Now, Doug Tallamy, if you haven't heard the name, he wrote the book, Bringing Nature Home, and another one that escapes my name. I can't think of it off the top of my head right now, but he's pretty well-known author. Other than native, non-native, there's the questions about bloom period. Make sure that you cover the entire bloom period that bees need, especially things like bumblebees. What color of plants do you put in there? Well, most of the time when we look at colors, we're thinking about ourselves, our own needs. Bees, interestingly enough, do not see red. And I know somebody's thinking, well, I've got bees on my red flowers during the summer. And if you do, that's because they've got ultraviolet markings. Whereas we see red, green, and blue, bees see green, blue, and ultraviolet. So if you're going to pick a red flower, just make sure that it's a known bee-friendly plant. In terms of diversity, study after study has shown that the more floral diversity you have in your landscape, the more bee diversity you get. You get more species. And that backyard that I talked about that maybe has 30 or 40 species, that's because they've got a very diverse floral flora there. Finally, drought tolerance is something that we need to think about, some more than others. I want to point out that one size does not fit all. When you look at bees, you find out that bees are roughly grouped into two types. If you look over here, picture number 9, this is a short-tongued bee. It's a mining bee, actually. If you look next to it, we've got a bee with a huge tongue. And this is a long-tongued bee. I'm using that in a kind of a descriptive sense. Now, there's some other technical definitions that I'm not going to get into here, but the point of this slide is to show you that this bee loves a flower like this wild rose up here, or this sunflower down here on number 8, because it can get to it really easily. This wild rose for this long tongue, well, this bee really isn't going to like it that much because it can be dragging its tongue around, but it might like this flower up here. So think about, this is one aspect of floral diversity, is the type of flower, not just the color. Larval host plants, I mentioned those earlier. They are regionally specific. And as I explained, they vary with butterfly and moth species. So there's these evolutionary relationships there that have to be maintained. And there are both flowering and non-flowering larval host plants. In fact, there's probably more non-flowering larval host plants. Maybe that's not exactly true. There's probably more species using flowering plants. Oak is an example of something that is a wonderful host plant for caterpillars. So I want to talk about keystone species. Keystone species of plants are much like the keystone in this arch. They provide critical support for an ecosystem. There's a very small minority of plant genera that support the vast majority of caterpillars and specialist bees. If you look up here at the top picture, this is a wild cherry. It's in the Apprentice genus. And that genus across its range is a host plant for 340 different caterpillar species. If you look down at the bottom, that's a goldenrod, and the genus of goldenrod hosts 49 different caterpillar species and 42 different specialist bees. And these specialist bees, as the name implies, they have really special requirements, and it's easy to lose these bees because it's hard to provide those in unnatural areas. And I'd like to just point out that 96% of terrestrial birds rely on insects that are supported by keystone species. Now, if you want to know more about keystone plants, there's a very good website. If it's a National Wildlife Federation. If you go to Google NWF keystone plants, and I'm just going to give you just a few moments here to write that down or take a screenshot or something. You can go for our ecoregion and get a great list of plants. That'd be both shrubs and herbaceous kind of plants. And if you're interested in helping out and maybe making sure you have more birds in your yard. Garden plants, what we'll call exotics, or the stuff that you typically would get in a nursery, they're okay if chosen carefully. As Doug Tallamy again points out, it's not the presence of non-natives that is destroying food webs, it's the absence of native plants that destroys our food webs. There are some plants that are called double-flowered varieties, and they're easy to recognize because, well, they've got just a huge number of petals. You don't really see anything else a lot of times. And these are no good for pollinators. The obvious reason being, well, how does a pollinator get into one of these things? The less obvious reason is that those extra petals typically come from stamens, which provide the pollen in a plant. And there's sometimes stamens will undergo a mutation that turns them into petals. Well, breeders take advantage of that to create these kind of species. Some plants you should really try to avoid: butterfly bush. It's on the most invasive list of the Pacific Northwest Plant Council, sorry. It's a larval host for only one out of over 700 species of butterflies in the US. And although there are supposedly some sterile cultivars out there, I have heard anecdotal evidence of a person that had one of these, and after a few years it became fertile. I don't really know, if that's absolutely true or not, but a word of caution. But why not put in something like an ocean spray? This is a beautiful plant, native to our region, and it's both a nectar and larval host plant. Tropical milkweed, probably not a lot of it up in the Vancouver area, but if you do have it, you have to make sure that it's situated where it freezes to the ground during the winter time. And it's really recommended that if you have tropical milkweed, that you go late in the fall and cut it down as close to the ground as you can. Reason is this stuff will pick up pathogens that will get on the monarch caterpillars, and the pathogens will overwinter. And that's why you've got to get rid of this stuff, put it in a bag, don't leave it in your landscape. If caterpillars carry this, they have a weakness into adulthood. So they're not as strong of adults as ones that are not exposed to this pathogen called OE. So finally, native is best. That's the thing to remember here. And you want to provide that floral coverage from, late winter, which is on the left-hand side, all the way through the seasons. If you recognize plants, you'll see that the fall plants are over on the right-hand side. Lawns, there's a guy named Dave Goulson, a big bumblebee expert. He recently released a book called Silent Earth. And he has a chapter called The Green Desert, and it talks about lawns. Well, in the US, we have 40 to 50 million acres of lawns. And that equates to about 70,000 square miles. If you go and rack that up in terms of area of states, somewhere around the size of North Dakota would be the equivalent state. And if you could take and replace, if we could get everybody to take out 10% of their yard, their lawn, I should say, and put in pollinator habitat, well, we get 4.5 million acres, say, which is more than Xerces has restored and protected in 50 years' time. What can you do with a lawn? Well, you can create an eco lawn. Well, there's a company down in Portland called PT Lawn Seeds, and they have mixes that will give you a lawn like the picture that you see above. From start, from a fresh lawn. They also have overseed mixes. Or you can put in a little wildflower meadow that's sized to your yard. These can be fairly small things called pocket meadows. And if you want to make it neat and tidy, you can have a mown edge around this thing so the neighbors know that you're not just lazy. Another thing is benign neglect. Some of you have probably heard of No Mow May, which is something where people let their lawns go for May. Dandelions and things come up, and it supports the pollinators during a pretty critical time period. Well, this is part of my front yard, and I follow No Mow Summer. And this is a time of year that, my wife doesn't really like because she's worried about what the neighbors think. And I say, well, to heck with the neighbors, I'm worried about the bees. So we compromise, and as it gets into the end of the summer, stuff is gone out of bloom, then I just mow it all down and we're back to where we were. Pesticides, let's go back to those. Avoid using them. If you have to use them, minimize their use. Read the guidance really carefully. But you have to keep something in mind. I didn't talk about this earlier, but pesticides, the toxicity varies with the size of the bee. Smaller bees can be much more heavily affected by pesticides. When they test pesticides for lethality and they come up with these guidelines, they use honeybees. And as bees goes, honeybees are fairly large bees. So that's a real danger in pesticides. And don't forget about the sublethal aspects of these. So let's go back to the bumblebees I talked about. That happened because of something called neonicotinoids. These are systemic insecticides. There are others besides neonicotinoids. And these systemics have the ability to stay in plant tissue for months or years, especially more woody plants. And they can get up into the nectar. And that is what happened to these bumblebees. They had injected some systemic pesticides into linden trees to kill off aphids. 2 weeks later, the blooms came, the bumblebees came, and you saw the result. If you buy plants, try to find out if they're treated with systemic insecticides. And if you cannot get a straight answer to that, or you get an answer that says, well, yeah, they are, then go somewhere else. And if you're at your local nursery that you want to support, tell them, hey, I'd really like to buy from you, but I'm only going to buy stuff if I know it's not treated with systemics. And, good companies will go and listen to their customers. Another thing you can do is think about using alternatives. There are many beneficial predators and parasitoids. Some of these things you can buy, And others will just show up if you put in good pollinator habitat. The thing about good pollinator habitat is what that really means is it's just a good local native ecosystem. And this will draw a lot of outside diversity of insects, and they will keep each other in check. If you walk out into a natural area, you don't see anything that's overrun with pests of any one type. And that's because if they get too thick, they're going to get eaten. So let's look at nesting, egg laying, and sheltering sites. That was the third principle I said we follow. Here, if you can retain natural or existing snags. That's for tunneling bees, but only do it if it's safe. It's nice to provide areas of bare ground. It doesn't have to be as much as this, and that's for ground nesting bees. If it's not really easy for you to provide bare ground, you can get a little helper like I have, and I've got bare ground all over my yard with his help. You don't have to have a lot of bare ground. Here, if you look at this picture, this is maybe 2 feet by 1 foot in this picture. And if you look closely, you'll see two things. Number one, you're going to see that I'm not a very good at weeding my yard. And number two, you're going to notice mining bee nest. In fact, you're going to notice 6 mining bee nests where these red circles are. So you don't have to have a lot of bare ground in order to provide something for your bees. As far as tunnel nesters, you want to have some plants with pithy stems. Here's a list of some of these. If you can put in a natural area like this, I mean, obviously it has to fit your yard and your particular situation, but these are great if you've got, and especially if you've got some of these pithy plants. And at the end of the day, you want to end up with a happy little bee like the Ceratina here. Nest blocks, these are something that you can make on your own or you can purchase. You've probably seen something like this in nursery stores. I'm not going to go into the details of making these, but you can go on to Xerces.org, and I'll show that later. And there's a huge amount of resources there that I'm going to point out. And these things really work. If you look carefully, you can see what you have. If you look at the top, you see that's green. It's plant material, and that's from a leaf cutter bee. On the bottom, you've got something that looks like a mud mixture, and those are mason bees. And you get more than just bees in there. This piece of straw is being carried in by a solitary wasp. These are little wasps that never bother you. They're not social wasps like yellow jackets or some of the paper wasps. We've got some campaigns going. One of them is called, Leave the Leaves. You can go on to Xerces.org to learn more about this, and learn about the importance of try to leave some leaves around over the winter time and not shred them. And we're not saying cover your whole yard with leaves, but try to go on to Xerces and look at that. Another campaign is Save the Stems, and this relates to these tunnel nesting bees I talked about. And there's ways that you can do your pruning to be most beneficial. So, and again, I don't have time to go through the details here, but please go onto the Xerces website and look into this if you're inclined to do so. So Xerces.org, if you can just remember that, up at the banner on the top, there's the resources, and under that, a Pollinator Conservation Resource Center. Each of these bars, if you click on it, has a tremendous amount of follow-on information. And this is an example of some of the things that you can download from there. Xerces has a lot of books that you can get. If you want to really dig in a little bit deeper about native pollinators, the one on the left here is great. If you're just interested in the plants, 100 Plants for the Bees is good. And I'd like to just stop for a moment and have you reflect on what I've said and why I've said it. The point I want to get across here is that if you build it, they will come. And these are all examples of what you can expect to start showing up in a really good local ecosystem. And you can see some of them are eating other insects, and they're doing their thing. They're controlling. The final thing that we try to do is share the word. And that's really what I'm doing here. We want you to be an advocate. If you're a social media type, you like that, maybe put some pictures up of some of the things you're doing to help pollinators in your own yard. You can put up signs and notices for your neighbors or anybody to explain what you're doing in your yard. These are handmade. These are an example of some that are professionally done. What other things can you do? Well, you can go to bringbackthepollinators.org and you can sign the pledge. And the pledge basically says, I'm going to follow these principles. Bee City USA, this is a really great organization. You can go to beecityusa.org to learn more about that. But basically, cities commit to creating a habitat and pesticide use regime that is beneficial to pollinators and other invertebrates. Real quickly, I did a search of affiliates, and it looks like somebody from Vancouver needs to step up. They've got 5, the triangles are bee cities, 5 of those kind of within 30 or 40 miles. And the blue dots are campuses. So there is a campus up at Longview. That is a bee campus affiliate. And if anybody is interested in this and wants more information, you can, get my contact information through Don. Xkids is a really great program. You go on to xerces.org/xkids to learn more about that. I don't have time to go into that because I'm going to run over too much. Community science, that's something that we're always looking for people that want to volunteer and help out. Xerces has a number of these, Bumblebee Watch, Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. I participate in both of those. Other organizations besides Xerces, Journey North, the Great Sunflower Project. There will soon be a Washington Bee Atlas, as I said. You're close enough, you could even be involved in the Oregon Bee Atlas if you wanted to. And there are some Washingtonians that are involved in that atlas. Finally, Xerces has a fairly active social media, especially YouTube, a really great YouTube channel with a lot of educational webinars available. Finally, we're a donor-supported nonprofit. So, we rely on members. If anybody thinks they might be interested, please go and, look further into it. We're 4-star rated by Charity Navigator. And that's the end of my presentation. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer those, especially if I can figure out how to get into a view where I can see y'all. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Dave. That was very interesting. I'm looking at the Q&A, not the Q&A, I'm looking at the chat. One person made a comment when you were talking about leaving more things in the yard, and that the comment was Clark County would have a fit if we did that, since it's a fire hazard, letting things grow in yard. And can you talk about that a little bit? Or
so we're talking about I need a little bit more specificity. I mean, are we talking about leaves over the winter? Because that surely is not a fire hazard. If you're talking about that natural area, when I talked about that, yeah, I mean, I'm not asking you to violate that. And so things like fireplace or fire safe zones around a building or something like that, sure, you have to keep those things in mind. The idea was that I just wanted to present to you things that are really attractive and beneficial to pollinators and other invertebrates. And you kind of have to figure out on your own whether, well, maybe this isn't exactly right. And you can actually go to the Xerces website find out a lot more information. And I'm always happy to, have emails shot my way if there's something I can do to help somebody out.
And then another member of our group said that Clark College is working on being a bee campus here in Vancouver. And there is a bee city group just getting started in Vancouver.
Oh, great. Okay, that's good to hear.
There's another comment. I'm busy digging up invasive blackberry and replacing it with natives. Am I destroying overwintering critters? The canes are going into a pile, not being burned or chopped. Finally, no herbicides.
Yeah, so you could have that little Serotina that I talked about. They love blackberries. Actually, if they can't dig into a blackberry, or they can't burrow into a blackberry, but if they've got a crack or a stem has been cut, they can get in. The thing I think you're doing the right thing. So what I do if I take things down is I cut them and then I put them into kind of a protected shaded area so they're not out in the hot sun, and then let the bees emerge. Oh, and they could emerge, since you don't know when they were active, they could, effectively emerge anytime over the spring through fall. And I just, leave them in a bundle in a kind of a protected area. And then once you get to the end of that, you can kind of assume, okay, anything that was in there is gone. And hopefully nothing has tried to reuse it. But, you get into this endless cycle somewhere along the line. You have to say, okay, enough's enough. But if you can give that first generation a chance, that's a nice way to do that. And, we always advise as you take stuff out, kind of balance, the replacement. Like, don't just take out an acre one year and go and, start putting things back over the next 2 to 3 years.
So I'd like to bring up a question about my yard, in that it was all landscaped at some point in the past, and they put down this ground cloth and then probably for many years put bark mulch over that. So down about 3 inches is this ground cloth, and it's kind of turned to soil above that. But I'm thinking that, to return it to a healthy site, all that ground cloth should be ripped out. Is that what you would say? Or
Yeah, you have exactly the same situation I inherited when my wife and I moved into this place here. And in my back area where I showed the picture of the mining bee nest, I ripped out the ground cloth. There was bark mulch there, and a lot of it had broken down. And I just left it. And there were areas where I cleared almost all of the bark dust. I left a little bit there to just kind of blend it, kind of feather it in a little bit so it didn't look so weird. But as you could see from my picture, they don't need a whole, they'll work between the bark dust. That's not an issue. Try not to dig it up, step in there, because they're pretty quick about building nests. So you don't necessarily know there's anything there, and you don't want to compact it too much if you can help it.
another question here is, would things like weed killer and mold killer substances be too dangerous for pollinators in my backyard?
Okay, so these are good questions. And I wish I actually have like a 2-hour version of this where I go into more detail. But so the thing that is most dangerous to pollinators and other invertebrates are actually fungicides. And those nasty little neonicotinoids that I talked about, sometimes when those two get together, the fungicides actually make the pesticides 10 times more deadly. Okay. As far as weed killers like glyphosate, we recommend not using them, but even in restoration projects, there are times when they have to use them. And they break down, relatively quickly. They don't directly impact most of the time invertebrates. And try to make sure you're not using it where and get into streams. That's not very good. Other than that, just use as little as you can.
Okay, well, so I have fruit trees on my property, and always in the spring it says to spray the trees with the not the oil to kind of smother any larvae and stuff that are on the stems. Is that a?
Yeah, neem oil. So, you're gonna hate asking me questions because like, oh yeah, neem oil can actually, if it gets back to the nest, it can affect the growth of larvae. I mean, that's how it works. As you just said, and if bees carry traces of that back, so you'll have mason bees probably, among others in those early fruit trees. If they carry it back, it can have adverse impacts on their larvae. Again, it's hard to balance some of these things sometimes, and that's why in pest management programs, they have this step where you kind of look and say, okay, am I really being hurt by this thing? Or am I just doing this prophylactically and it doesn't really need to be done? What is the level of damage that I'm sustaining, and how much damage am I willing to sustain? That's like a basic part of pesticide management programs, integrated pesticide management programs, is look and judge the harm.
Okay. Would hummingbird feeders distract the bees from pollinating flowers? Should I take down the feeders in spring and summer?
The only thing that I am aware of that that I've seen attracted to hummingbird feeders would be yellow jackets and maybe honeybees. I've never seen, it would be some kind of a specialist bee, by the way. So the majority of these that it would be a generalist bee. The majority of like specialist bees would, no way in heck are they going to go over there. Because one thing that doesn't have any pollen. Okay. So, typically a bee is going to want to use a plant that is providing both pollen and nectar. They will go to nectar only plants if they need to do it that way. But so, yeah, they're not really, I wouldn't consider them a problem. I've got like 4 of them up here. Now, let me add one thing. When you're not in a wintering period, so you're getting into having adequate natural floral resources, you shouldn't, my belief is you shouldn't have them out anyway. Because it's not as healthy as them getting stuff. When they go into they get more than just sugar water. There's other, there's amino acids and other things in plant nectar that you don't provide in sugar water. So that, to me, you're getting them through the winter and then take that stuff down.
Does it help to provide water for bees in our dry summers? If so, what is a good, easy way?
Okay. They will normally get their water needs out of nectar. But there are some species that really rely on or benefit from a water source. Mason bees, for instance, they use mud in various stages, like capping their brood chambers. And so there is one example. And then other ground nesting bees actually use a little bit of water to soften compacted soil so they can start getting down. But a way to provide that, if you've got like a drip irrigation and you have a drip going, you can dig maybe this doesn't have to be it could be 6 inches by 6 inches, dig it down about, 10 inches or something like that, and put a drip in it. You don't want a puddle in the bottom, but you want to provide a moisture gradient. And what this allows, the fact that you've got this 10-inch gradient between the surface moisture level and kind of water, is that the bee has the opportunity, especially mason bees, they're going to go and pick from mud that has the right moisture level that they want. And so that allows them to get exactly what they need instead of having to deal with second best. I can't think of any other ways to do that real easily. I mean, that's one that just really comes to mind. I mean, you could have another area that you sprinkle by hand every day or something like that, but that's about it.
What about ant control around the foundation of a house? Is that?
So if you've got somebody that's applying, for ants and it's kept at the foundation, it's very unlikely that that's going to be impacting pollinators much. I'm not saying that, I'm an advocate of pesticides, but, we have to do what we have to do, right? We can't let things destroy our structures and such. So, as long as it's something that's necessary, well, if it's necessary, it's necessary.
Okay. There's a comment here about vitamin D is photosynthesized in the skin by humans and all creatures that need it using ultraviolet B light. A minimal amount is obtained from diet. Red and near infrared light are used by humans, animals, and plants in many processes. An important example is one pathway for ATP synthesis in mitochondria. So that was just a comment that.
Oh yeah, okay, I see it. I'm looking at it right now.
So it's not really a question.
I didn't talk about vitamin D. I said amino acids, but.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions here. And so I think it was great. It was a great presentation, Dave. Really informative. You had a lot of resources there for people to check out on their own when they have the time and start putting some of these ideas into play into their own yards or places that they can have some control over. So really appreciate your time. And we will keep this, we're going to keep this video on our website, and hopefully others can take a look at it as well.
Okay, great. Sometime, Don, could I get you to send a count? I know I looked at the number of we report this in. I looked at the participants, but I see some double names on some of these spots. So if you can just kind of give me a rough ballpark of what you feel like.
Yeah, I guess I would only go by, I mean, I saw 33 participants at one point. And I know that some of those had more than one person watching at the same time. So, I guess around 40 total.
Okay. Like I said, it doesn't have to be exact, but it's, just a metric that's tracked by Xerces in terms of what our outreach is.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank you all for staying on with me and providing the opportunity for me to talk to you about this.
Okay. Thank you, Dave.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.